Former editor-in-chief of the Daily Caller News Foundation and a founder of the internet company RightForge. I'll be your moderator today. Thank you to our funders, the Arthur Roop Foundation, the Karpus Foundation, and Southern Methodist University's Campus Partners, Young Americans Foundation. And thank you for coming out on a beautiful spring day. That quad was inviting. And thank you to Whitney Tipton for organizing this event and putting it together. Corporate political statements and action have recently become a strongly debated topic. Both sides have called for boycotts, countless boycotts against different brands and companies. It seems like every single week we have a new story. This past week began with the CEO of Disney saying he's not going to be political and ended with him in a fight with the governor, so you never quite know. And what of government involvement also? Should the free market reign and should it be unhindered, or should there be legislative encouragement for socially responsible actions amongst corporations? To discuss it and debate it today, we have two smart people with us. Scott Baradell, he's a PR man by trade and the founder and CEO of Idea Grove, where he helps companies shape their brands and guide their public profiles. He has a book coming out called Trust Signals, Brand Building in a Post-Truth World. Jim Copland is a senior fellow and director of legal policy at the Manhattan Institute. In his past lives, he was a management consultant with McKinsey, a law clerk, and a director of two privately held manufacturing companies. He's widely published, and his opinions on corporate governance are sought by congressmen, reporters, and the rest. And his book is called The Unelected, How an Unaccountable Elite is Governing America. Thank you both for joining us. Now, first let's define what we're talking about. The conversation's not about small private companies. If a bar wants to put up a rainbow flag out front or an American I stand with the troops flag, that's not really a discussion. It's more the big guys, the corporations, the publicly traded ones, those that are on the stock exchange, those with thousands of employees. And you have different ideas over what responsibilities they have, what politics they have, do they owe, and where exactly they owe their responsibilities, and if their politics can be helpful or hurtful to their bottom line and to America. But Scott, why don't you lay out kind of the philosophy that drives you, that you've written about, of this corporate responsibility ideas and how the duty might not always just be to the shareholder.
Yeah, that speaks to the idea of stakeholder capitalism. Primacy among public companies and companies overall, whether you're VC funded or however you get your funding, that's ultimately who you answer to. And the idea of stakeholder capitalism, which got a lot of attention a couple of years ago when the Business Roundtable had 190 plus CEOs of some very big companies sign a statement committing to stakeholder capitalism being the direction of the future of these companies, meaning that not just shareholders, but also employees, also customers, also the broader community. These different constituencies were all important. I think, Jim, in one of a great article you wrote, you said this was kind of a truism. It's not necessarily anything revolutionary, but I think having been in corporate communications for companies like Belo and others for many years, and then counseling companies for the last 17 at an agency, I can tell you that, companies generally have been brought to this idea of stakeholder capitalism kind of kicking and screaming. In other words, they're really looking at how am I going to grow my business, how am I going to maximize profits, pay my employees. These are not bad things. But I think what's happened is from the outside, you can blame social media, you can just blame the values of a new generation. Younger people in particular, that 18 to 35-year-old group and under 18 that's showing even more so, they want companies to have values. They want the values to resonate with their own. They're making decisions on what they purchase, not just based on the features and benefits of a product, the speeds and feeds of a tech product, but whether they feel that brand represents them. It used to be things like, oh, Nike represents being adventurous and going for it. Those would be the kind of aspirations built into a brand that someone would identify with. But now it's branching out into Nike represents Colin Kaepernick. Nike represents other things that it gets into areas that can be difficult to negotiate, as you were referencing. Oh, I'm not going to be controversial, and then you're arguing with the governor. Or Coca-Cola just wants to put out a statement saying, we support voting rights, and then they get pulled into criticizing a specific piece of legislation. Those are two very different things. I would just say companies are trying to negotiate this, but it's kind of a minefield. And in corporate communications and in PR, we're trying to help them through it, but it's not easy.
Oh, what say you? Where should companies fall? Is this a positive thing? And
Sure. I agree with most of what was just said, other than I think the blanket support for the notion of stakeholder capitalism, and I think pretty clearly on the record as being a critic of stakeholder capitalism, although it's important to define what you mean by that when you're talking about stakeholder capitalism. Clearly, any business that wants to be successful, any large business that wants to be successful, has to be responsive to customers, to suppliers, to employees, to lenders, to the local communities, to government agencies, et cetera. So that's what I said in my Washington Post piece reacting to the Business Roundtable thing, because everyone was saying, oh, they're looking for a shift to from shareholder to stakeholder capitalism. And I think 183 out of the 191 CEOs signed on to that. But that's not exactly what they were doing if you really parse the words, which is what, I'm trained as a lawyer. That's what we're trained to do, is parse these words. They weren't saying they want to give up shareholder primacy as a fiduciary duty, but they were stating this truism. Of course, you've got to look at all these sorts of questions. So absolutely true. And I think it's become a more complex environment. We can sort of discuss some of those reasons why. And we can discuss some of the reasons why I think stakeholder capitalism per se as an organizing principle is ill-conceived. But that doesn't mean that a CEO of a company have to do this. I mean, the starting point here, I think, is important. I mean, we're not talking about a wholly owned corporation. We're talking about situations where you've got large aggregations of capital, which basically equity investors, equity owners, as well as other stakeholders, but equity owners in particular are owed specific fiduciary duties. We can talk about why that is, have given that capital up to these individuals, and the managers, by and large, aren't the same. Now, there are some companies that are a little different, where the founder still has a control stake, and maybe that's due to a two-tiered voting structure, maybe it's not. So good luck getting Berkshire Hathaway to do something Warren Buffett doesn't want, or good luck if you're the founders of, the Bezos or the founders of Google or these sorts of folks. I mean, they own big blocks, and often some of them may have double-tiered voting structures with their shares, so they have control of the company. And you know that when you buy the shares going in. So as an investor, your money's out there. But otherwise, we've got these folks that they didn't start the company, they weren't necessarily there when you invested in the company, they're playing with other people's money. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind. And they have large aggregations of this money, and they're exerting significant control over the political process. Now, to some degree, again, as a truism, corporations have to be involved in politics. I mean, they always are going to have lobbying organizations. They have to communicate to political decision makers, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think we've seen a paradigm shift. So the posters here had Colin Kaepernick, sort of, we were saying, Colin Kaepernick's out there, the face of Nike. When I was a freshman at University of North Carolina, there was an ongoing Senate campaign in North Carolina between Harvey Gantt, the Democrat, black guy, first black mayor of Charlotte, running against Jesse Helms, who was, the hard right incumbent senator from North Carolina. And a bunch of people were trying to get Michael Jordan, an alumnus of UNC, a North Carolina native, to come out there and intervene in this campaign. Now, I don't think he actually said this. I think it's apocryphal, but he basically didn't get involved. And the apocryphal statement that was attributed to Michael Jordan is, Republicans buy shoes too, right? He had a brand. He had a Nike brand. He wasn't going to get involved in politics. There's been a paradigm shift in that, where now Nike is associating its brand with a controversial individual, Colin Kaepernick, who is known less for his quarterback play, although he had some good quarterback play for a couple years there, and more for his political stances. And Nike's leaning into that, not leaning away from it. So, I think this paradigm shift is troubling, but I think there are reasons for it, and there's reasons why corporate decision makers are doing that. And I don't think it's all just capture. You've got a bunch of left-wing CEOs that want to do this. I mean, I think there's a strategy there. I mean, there are exceptions to that. But by and large, most people who go to the C-suite as CEO types want to make money. That's why they get into that line of business as opposed to others. Now, that's not necessarily true from some of the other influencers. And this we can talk about too. So the owners themselves, these shareholders, are now aggregated. So you've got the big 5 institutional investing fund families that own 30% of the stock market, and some of those folks are leaning in now on political questions and pushing corporate managers in a certain direction, and then directors who have to get their votes to get on the boards of directors are being responsive to that sort of pressure. I do think a lot of it's bubbling up from employees. I think less of it's for customers, but it really is important to look at your brands. And are you a business-to-business business selling to other businesses? Are you a business-consumer business? And if you're a business-to-consumer business, what do your customers look like? And that's going to influence how companies can lean into this, but they can overcorrect here and they go too far. I mean, Coca-Cola leaned into voting rights a year ago. The general counsel was gone 6 months into the job after they made that decision, and so they can have blowbacks on this. And Disney's fighting this internally now on some things, and so we can talk about some of the particulars. But that's the basic picture here. I worry about it from 2 perspectives. One is the business perspective. I think when we start getting away from a singular profit maximization motive to maximize share value, it inhibits the abilities of businesses to grow. Understanding that these other stakeholders are important to driving that value. But as soon as we get away from that singular point, I think it inhibits business growth, and that means overall, in the aggregate, we're all going to be worse off over time. But the second thing is, we're outsourcing major political questions to a significantly higher degree than we used to these aggregate leaders of aggregate capital who are taking the general public's money and then using their positions to influence political debate in a way that I find pretty disturbing, because I wrote a book called The Unelected. I'm worried about muting these sorts of political feedback mechanisms in our democracy broadly, and this is one way, and I think one of the most pernicious ways that I see that going on.
When companies come to you, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I wanted to speak to that because I think it's a really interesting and important point. It's true, except by their boards, corporate CEOs are unelected, right? These are not folks in Washington or any capital. They've not been chosen through the political process to have influence over these issues. A big reason why the public, and particularly younger people, are trying to get their voice heard through companies, through the brands that they buy products from, is because they actually feel like they can have more influence on change going through companies by either providing or withdrawing their support than they can have in a gridlocked political system. It's a sign of cynicism and lack of trust in politicians, in government, in the political system overall. And it's like, well, I can't get anything done that I want done in Washington or in Austin. I feel like my opinion is worthless, but if I join this group of people that are influencing this brand to take a point of view, then I've had an impact. It's a way to have an impact at a time when a lot of people feel more powerless. There's a global PR firm called Edelman. Every year they do a really impressive survey, because it involves like 30,000 people. It's the Edelman Trust Barometer. And increasingly every year, it's shown declines in trust in government, in media, even in NGOs, decline across the board in trust, public trust. The only thing that stayed steady and increased is in corporations, in CEOs. And in particular, people trust most the CEO of their own employer, and as it gets closer to home. And so this is where people trust, but in return for that trust, they're wanting CEOs and companies to exercise more power. You're right, they're unelected, but in terms of just a regular person, they feel like I can have more say in things if I work through influencing a corporation than voting.
When these companies come to you, what's driving them off most often? I know you can't name names, these are private clients, but some of them, you got maybe the CEO who just really wants to do good. This is something he believes in. You have the CEO who's in a lot of trouble, like Carnegie Library. The reason we have so many Carnegie institutes around the country is because Carnegie got in a lot of trouble at one point and had to put his name out there. And how much of them are captive to employees or HR departments or other groups that are saying, this is something that I demand, and they feel like they need to react?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say the first thing I counsel any company, most of our clients are mid-size. Over the years, I've worked for public companies on the corporate side, a couple of them, New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, other public companies and other exchanges. My clients for my company, Idea Grove, are mostly mid-size. We've only had 1 or 2 public companies over the years. So the average size of one of our clients might be $20 to $500 million in revenues, and private. But whether they're public or private, what I advise is separate your situation and your beliefs as CEO from what your brand is, because they're not the same thing. And when a CEO, it's like you're saying, Warren Buffett is Berkshire Hathaway, right? But you can get yourself in trouble. I'll give you an example without naming names that happened about a year ago. We had a client. He had a really cool technology. He wanted tier 1 media coverage, which everybody does, right? We do PR. But he very specifically only wanted it in certain outlets. And his reason was that they were the only ones that told the truth and the other ones didn't. And he didn't want to be associated with these other outlets, right? And I'm like, that as CEO, as an individual, is what you may believe. But I'm in studying the market for what you're selling, there's just as many people who believe these people are trustworthy and these aren't. So you're just cutting your market in half for no reason by just going with your personal belief. If, on the other hand, you do research and you find out that your target customer overwhelmingly has a certain set of values and points of view, that's the direction to take your brand. Brands are not people, right? Brands are not people. However, people want a brand to act human. And they want the brand to reflect who they are. It needs to be a reflection of them, not the CEO. That's where you've got misplaced power, and it's not going to help the company in the long run. But I would argue, whether you call it shareholder capitalism, stakeholder capitalism, if as a brand you're reflecting the people that are influencing your success and reflecting back their values and the things that are important to them, you'll be more successful than if you just try to sell them something. It's like if we meet at a party and all I'm trying to do is tell you about what I'm selling, then you'll go somewhere else, right? But if I'm giving you ideas, then in my world they call that thought leadership. I'm sharing ideas about the industry. Or if I'm talking about things that are important to me, like there are things that if you remove the wedge issues are very universally appealing. Sustainability, for example. Sustainability as a concept, if you don't dive into things like climate change, for example, and you just stick to sustainability, broad bipartisan support. DEI has broad bipartisan support. If you don't take it to critical race theory, if you don't take it to Black Lives Matter, if you stick to these areas in the social sphere where you can make positive change without kind of touching stepping on those landmines that are going to create divisiveness. So that's generally what I advise clients is find that sweet spot where people feel like you're doing more than just trying to make a buck, but not going into those areas that needlessly antagonize a certain subset of your customers.
And there are forces outside of even inside the company, whether it's mistakes or employees or the CEO's point of view. The environmental social governance ratings, the ESG ratings that they've been around for at least 20 years now, but have really been starting to gain momentum, have been pushing companies to try and make those scores and possibly be rated by them. Will Blackstone invest in my work with my company if I don't hit this certain amount, for example? Charles Payne, a business pundit and consultant, has called that among the biggest threats he's ever seen to the future of American capitalism. I think a lot of people don't even know what it is, and maybe it's not a threat. Maybe it's a good thing. Maybe it's positive. So, Jim, I'd be interested in hearing your read on that and where it is and where it's going.
I think it's broadly pernicious, but I think it's important, again, to sort of talk about what we're talking about, environment, social, governance. They like to glob these together. Governance is very different than environment and social, right? I mean, when you talk about shareholder corporate governance, how you elect the board of directors, when you elect the board of directors, how you count up votes, who's the chairman of the board and how do you figure out. These are actually very important to the value of the corporation. The environmental and social stuff, you can create theoretical constructs. I mean, clearly, you've got to worry about the regulatory structure if you're an oil company. Clearly, you've got to worry about various, what would be couched as employee rights or any of these sorts of things. I mean, I track these shareholder proposals, and we've seen a shift, and we're seeing it currently with the current Securities and Exchange Commission, which is one of these independent agencies, but it's why the presidential elections matter more than they probably should for U.S. policy, because Congress has delegated to these independent agencies. So whenever you get a new president, you get a new majority and a new chairman, and that president's agenda can drive it. So you'll flip-flop with 3-2 votes in each direction depending on who controls the White House. So the White House becomes higher stakes. I mean, the pointer is absolutely right. I mean, I think our system is designed for gridlock, right? I mean, it's designed for consensus, really. It's a conservative design. It's a design that's designed to be, we're supposed to have a limited government that moves by consensus, and by consensus that means you need a majority of the popular vote roughly, which is the House. You need a majority of the states over time, which is the Senate. And then you also have this sort of check with the elected president that sort of merges both a little bit. And the president's got to sign on too, and you've got to pull these all together. It's actually not that easy to do, to build this sort of consensus, because everybody has a vested interest in the status quo to some degree. You've organized your affairs around it. If you're a business enterprise, you've made investment decisions based on the prior set of rules. So you can certainly lobby to try to get your way, but when you're doing that, you're probably hurting somebody else, and they're going to lobby in the other direction. So this is really designed for gridlock. And I don't know that people totally appreciate that, but what Congress has sort of done, and what I write about in my book, is they've offloaded it to these independent agencies, et cetera, and that's what we're seeing now with this environmental social stuff. Now, there's pretty good evidence out there on the environmental stuff that these environmental ratings are arguably negatively correlated, not just with share value, but actual environmental values if you start measuring them the right way. The social ones tend to have almost no relationship, and the G, it kind of depends. There's certain, you can look at various sort of empirical studies and show, well, yeah, these G mechanisms actually matter for share value. And so I think it's important to sort of break these apart, but the overall dynamic that we're hearing about here is you've got these sort of 5 institutional fund families: BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, Fidelity, American funds that own 30%, close to a third of the total stock market. And they're making a lot of these decisions. And this is very different. I mean, our security system, when it was set up in 1933 and 1934 at the beginning of the New Deal, was designed to protect individual investors, and you didn't have these big mutual funds and pension funds the way we do now. So that's the system we've got designed. And now we've got these big holders of assets. And the other ones, the other institutional investors that don't pay attention to their voting, outsource those to one of 2 foreign-owned proxy advisory firms with small staffs that tell them how to vote. And so they control roughly the equivalent of 25% of the stock market. So you've got a majority of the stock market voting. And so it's easy to see how activists want to get on this, because you can actually change how the corporation behaves with a majority plebiscite by controlling these few levers. These offices, I agree, if you poll with nebulous things like sustainability or diversity, they're going to poll pretty well. But you've got these things set up in every big business. So there's, in addition to your HR business, which is responsive to employee concerns, buttressed by U.S. law on employment law, you also have a DEI office at every big enterprise. You have a sustainability type office at every big enterprise. And the people that go into these offices, HR, DEI, sustainability, unlike those C-suite CEOs we were talking about, aren't necessarily in it for the money. I mean, they want to get paid well for what they do. Everyone does. But they are going into that field because they're passionate about that issue. And they're often driving the agendas on this too. Now, a good CEO is going to put the brakes on them a lot and lead to internal frustration. But we do see this, so we see it from the top down, from the shareholder pressure with this concentration of capital. And to be cynical, most of these big institutional investing families I mentioned are by and large index funds today. This is great for an individual investor. When you start investing your money, dollar cost average it into index funds and forget about it. Don't try to play the stock market unless you go to Wall Street and really know what you're doing. Just do this, invest in the stock market, you're gonna make good money. The index funds are low cost and they follow the market. That's how these are by and large set up, these institutional investors. But what does that mean? They're not even picking stocks. They're only replicating the market basket for what Standard & Poor's puts in the S&P 500 or the equivalent sorts of market baskets they're looking at. But what they do have are these sort of shareholder relations, corporate governance apparatus groups that are taken over to a significant degree by these DEI folks and by the sustainability folks that are driving that agenda. Now, the Securities and Exchange Commission until the mid-'70s said, corporations can exclude that stuff from the ballot. There were people trying to get on the ballot, things about like segregation in the South. Nope, you can exclude it. It's not about share value. You can exclude it from the ballot. DC Circuit came out with an opinion, reversed one of those. The SEC flipped its position. It didn't have to. And what they've done within the last year is say, you can get these things on the ballot, and they don't even have to be material to the corporation. At least until the last year, they had to be material. So you had to actually construct, at least theoretically, this is going to affect the overall corporate returns. Now, if it's a matter of public interest, these activists, you buy, $2,000 worth of stock in a company. It's all you got to buy. Hold it for a while. You can start playing politics in the company. And so people have figured this out, and they've started doing it. I do think, though, I think that's really important, and I think in the long run it might be the most important, but I do think a lot of what we see today is employee-driven. And it's in particular industries that have concentrated groups of employees with particularized interests. And so this is why Amazon, which controls 85% of the non-print book market and about a majority of the print book market, Amazon will take off Ryan Anderson's book on transgenderism, is the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. He's not some random guy. Takes it off because employees at the company, say this is offensive to us, takes it off. Now, the other books, Abigail Schreier's book, stays on Amazon. So how these things work, and then Netflix, there's an outcry, we want to take Dave Chappelle off. Well, Netflix knows Dave Chappelle's really popular, and they don't want to take him off, so that they'll push back against the employees. But this is what you see a lot of.
Joe Rogan not being banned by Spotify because he's
same thing. He's their profit center.
He's too powerful.
He's their profit center. So, but again, what we've got is you've got to have an enormous audience, or you can get squashed by these forces. So as you go out into the corporate world, if you're not that level of person, you can get squashed pretty easily. And so it's gosh, I would be terrified if I didn't work at a free market conservative oriented think tank that basically agrees with my beliefs and pays me to say them, right? I mean, if I worked at a regular corporation, I would be terrified of this sort of situation. And so this is what people are getting really agitated with. I think it's something your generation is going to have to face, and it's going to be because there are people there in the business. We want to do it. Here's a good example. In the law space, I mean, King & Spalding was a firm, pretty sure. King & Spalding in Atlanta employed Paul Clement, the former Solicitor General of the United States, who argues more cases before the U.S. Supreme Court than any lawyer alive, who's not a government lawyer, any private lawyer alive. They pushed him out because he was representing the U.S. House of Representatives in defense of the 1990s Defense of Marriage Act on same-sex marriage. And it's because they had a bunch of lawyers there. They're like, we can't take this position. We're offended by this position. And this is what lawyers do, by the way. Lawyers take unpopular positions, including Judge Brown Jackson, who's like, yeah, she's taken some unpopular positions as a private lawyer. That's what lawyers do. That's what John Adams did, at the Boston Massacre. Paul Clement's taking this for the House. He has to leave. So he's their number one person. Now, he's not necessarily the number one profit center in terms of the rainmaker of the firm, but they're the number one person in the United States arguing before the Supreme Court has to leave the firm because of these internal employee dynamics. And so these things are very real issues going on right now, and it is a tricky thing. It's why it's why you get paid to help people navigate this, because it is a very tricky thing for corporations to navigate. But I mean, I think the bigger the issue gets, the more disturbing it is, because I like our constitutional structure and the notion that we're not only going to delegate these out to independent agencies that at least have to go through presidential nomination and Senate confirmation, but instead have these titans of capital who they're talented people. You don't get to be CEO of BlackRock if you're not talented. But when you start doing that and leaning in on these corporations and saying, we're going to change the way all these businesses work, we're not buying and selling businesses. This is not a hedge fund that's saying, I'm going to buy this company, I'm going to short that company, I'm going to buy his stock, I'm going to sell his stock to make money. And I can buy this company and turn it around by throwing out the CEO or the board because they're underperforming. These people are putting their money where their mouth is. They're taking big bets. These people aren't making any bets. They're just replicating the S&P 500 portfolio, and they're leaning in. And these ESG funds, this is the final point I'm making. I'm rambling a little bit, but there's this conflict of interest internally. They make more money on the ESG funds than on the index funds. People feel good about the ESG funds if they comport with your political worldview and beliefs. We're going to invest in them. They make more money. The index funds is a very, very price competitive market. They drive the price that you pay per share way, way down, because all you're doing is replicating the S&P 500. Here, there's more discretion. It's on these environmental and social issues, and so they vote their index fund shares consistent with the interests of their ESG shares, which isn't their fiduciary duty, but it's what they do.
So Scott, do you want to respond first, or?
Yeah, just on one point that I think is important, and it's something that I've heard that has always kind of made me laugh, is in the last couple years since some big companies came out against some of these voting legislation stuff, this narrative that there's all these woke liberal CEOs. It's just not true. I've been around CEOs my whole life. They're not genetically wired to be wild-eyed liberals. They are, in general, by the traditional definition, conservative, in that they don't like to make waves. They don't like a lot of change. They just want to just kind of proceed along. They like low taxes. They like to not be interfered with by the government. They like low regulatory environments. This is what CEOs like. The reason why this kind of woke CEO narrative has emerged is because CEOs got stuck in a difficult position between, as under Trump, the Republican Party has, and I think as Republicans have said, gotten it more working class oriented, more oriented around cultural issues rather than the economic issues that have traditionally driven the Republican Party. You could say most CEOs are more like the George H.W. Bush kind of Republican, right? And that's not what the party has become now. They have felt, because they're feeling it from below, their employees and customers, that they can't keep going in that direction. They're trying to find a place of moderation where they can keep everybody happy. And it's obviously very difficult for that to work in this environment. And so figuring out who your core base is as customers or an audience and what they believe, and that's why that's so important today, because you can't please everybody like you could think you were doing in the past.
That brings to mind Mark Zuckerberg, who I just imagine in my head running through his headquarters all day from a mob, just trying to figure out which one's upset at me now and reacting.
And these tech companies, by their nature, they have employees that are high human capital. Goldman Sachs is another one. I mean, Goldman Sachs is saying, we're not going to take a company public if you don't have certain diversity metrics on your board. But again, I mean, the people get paid a lot there. The same with these tech companies. They're very valuable employees. Walmart has a very different business model, very different employee base. And they're less worried about losing most individual employees than these sort of creative tech type companies, in entertainment and tech. Now, the reality is these entertainment tech companies and the finance companies can be the choke points. The finance companies, the choke points for capital. The tech companies can be too, so they can take something like Parler and take it off. There's only two. It's a duopoly with Apple and Google. They can take it off the market. Or they can take books off the market if you're Amazon. If you're Google or Facebook, you can take advertisers off the market. So there's an enormous level of power, and the people internally know that, right? So they're able to sort of leverage
It's almost got their own little big countries at this point that they're leading. These, what's happened, and I think on both sides of the political aisle, there's agreement that particularly with these very large tech companies, they've been allowed to get too big, and whether your disagreement with them is that the feeling is that they have a political bias, or that how they're managing their workforces, or anything in between, you don't find a lot of issues that Donald Trump and Elizabeth Warren agree on, right? But breaking up big tech companies is one of them. They have so much power and money and lobbying power that even with this kind of very broad-based support, it may never happen. But, if you broke up Google, if you broke up Facebook, if you broke up Amazon, and this is just breaking up, reversing some acquisitions. If they could, Facebook would have acquired TikTok, right? They knew they couldn't. They knew they couldn't. That would be a bridge too far. Well, maybe Instagram was a bridge too far, and that shouldn't have been allowed, and that could be reversed. So that's the kind of thing that if you did that, then some of this incredible mass of power that's in the hands of very few people can be dispersed. Because,
but it's hard to do in practice. I mean, I agree with you, and it's hard to do in practice, which is why, as someone who thinks about antitrust and I look at these sorts of things, it's not clear. I mean, listen, I grew up in a world where there was competition in search, right? I mean, we had Ask Jeeves and Web Crawler and all these. There's a South Park episode where they're going through all these old search things. We had them all, and then you sort of get one that dominates, and a technology dominates, just like, originally the laser discs competed with DVDs, and the Betamax competed with VCR, and usually there's a standard that'll predominate here, and so it's not that there aren't efforts. I mean, Microsoft keeps trying in search and whatever. I mean, it's not like, I don't think Google inevitably has a monopoly, but they've got a lot more resources to keep reinvesting in their algorithms, right? So that helps. And then Facebook is almost an eBay, which is a little different. I don't think people are worried about that now, but Amazon for sure. I mean, they've just got so much information that they pull, and Facebook, the network effect, to replicate, okay, well, most of the people in my high school class, most of my friends from college, I mean, I'm connected to them. To try to replicate that with a new entrant is tricky, right? So it is a tricky thing to think about the competition. I think it's something we ought to be thinking about, whether the competitive dynamic is there. But we also need to think about nuts and bolts things. And so Justice Thomas last year had a concurrence. They were sort of talking about common carrier regulation when it comes to, like buses and ends. I mean, you basically have to take someone as they come, right? And the same thing, you're not going to get, your power is not going to get cut off. Your telephone line, just because the phone company doesn't like you, they can't cut you off. No, I think actually applying this when the company does content moderation, Twitter, Facebook, is tricky, but there are certain nuts and bolts things that we're trying to think about right now where you can do it, where you can create potential at least new entrants and potential new competition here.
And the reason that's being thought about is because I think big tech's one of the few examples of a part of the American economy that may have gone too far, in that Republicans were traditionally the anti-regulatory group, and big tech largely has taken, at least their employees, sides against the Republican Party, so they ended up with no allies in D.C.
Yeah.
But Scott, one thing I've noticed is the old mantra of go woke, go broke, at least as far as consumers go, does not seem to hold any water anymore. Nike's as profitable as ever. My aunt goes to Facebook to yell about the liberal oligarchs. I've gotten 2 pictures from social conservatives with their family at Disney just in the past week. Even on the other side, Chick-Fil-A doubled its profits basically. Whole Foods did very well under their old CEO during an alleged boycott. So what downsides do most of these companies face, at least on the retail side, from this, if any?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think it especially for the large brands, it speaks to their size and power. And you would really have to take a enormous misstep, and they generally avoid missteps through research. You don't think Nike knew exactly what was going to happen when it aligned with Colin Kaepernick? It did its research. If the research came back and said everyone's going to burn their shoes, they wouldn't align with Colin Kaepernick. It said this small group will burn their shoes. This other group will buy more shoes. This group is bigger than this group for Nike, therefore this is the direction we go. So I think there's a lot of market research that goes into these corporate decisions. Ultimately, there are examples of companies that go too far, but you're right. When you get big enough, you've got kind of a lot of leeway to have opinions that don't really hurt your brand. I don't know. If you look at an example of an American Airlines or Coca-Cola, these are some of the biggest. I mean, you can't even get American Airlines to give you just basic human decency when you're trying to get on a flight, right? So the idea that they can take,
on it tomorrow.
The idea that they can take a political opinion that's going to make me figure out what I'm going to fly Spirit. It's not. These are companies that are so big and have so much power that even if you said, you know what, I want to take a stand against Coca-Cola, probably you're drinking Mountain Dew and don't realize it's a Coca-Cola product. These are massive organizations with numerous brands. They fill up the shelves everywhere. When you get into smaller companies, it's easier to have an impact. No one's going to buy MyPillow except people that like Mike Lindell, right? You have to be aligned politically. This is something where a CEO made a decision not because the product is more functional or serves a particular group, but he's become so associated with it that people will buy it just to support him, and then others, of course, would stay away from it.
He differentiated the pillow brand.
He differentiated the pillow brand politically. That is hard to do.
I rarely look at brands when I'm shopping for pillows, but I guess he made it.
He did.
Just to clarify, as someone who lives in New Bern, North Carolina, the birthplace of Pepsi Cola, and is 3 blocks where I live from the birthplace of Pepsi Cola, Mountain Dew is a Pepsi brand. Coca-Cola is Mellow Yellow.
See, I don't even know the difference.
Coca-Cola has Mellow Yellow, but nobody knows
Mellow
this,
Yellow.
which is the point. Mellow Yellow, and Coke has Sprite, and
I'm a Moxie man.
like what is it? Slice or whatever is the Pepsi
we
version.
drink Dr. Pepper here.
Yeah, Dr. Pepper is a separate. I mean, it's not independent. There's a lot of things merged with it, but it's separate from those two, right? So the big two. But yeah, I mean, and people like one or the other, right? I mean, listen, you go to a restaurant, and you sort of take what they give you, and what are you going to do? Say, I'm not going to drink Coke. These consumer boycotts almost always don't do much. That's the point. So but that gives these CEOs some degrees of latitude here to lean in. I mean, I think where they run into the most trouble is when they get closer to pure politics, right? I mean, after Citizens United, right? I mean, very controversial. The President of the United States, Barack Obama, calls out the Supreme Court, and Justice Alito says that's not true under his breath. Big thing. Citizens United 2010 says corporations can spend money on politics. In other words, the First Amendment protection against free speech.
So how much are Republicans
There's not a
regretting
corporate
that?
exception, but they don't. But the corporations don't spend on it. I mean, listen, they give money to trade associations. They spend a lot on lobbying. They're not taking out. Coca-Cola supports the Republican Party in this election. Why? Because the basic Michael Jordan truism: Democrats and Republicans both buy soda, both buy shoes, is true. I mean, if you're a niche player, if you're Lindell and you're MyPillow, it's a niche thing. But by and large, they know that, and so if people get mad at Chick-Fil-A because they've got Christian conservative owners, which is why they close on Sunday, it's their company, they can do what they want with it, but if they get mad at that because they've given to some groups that people are saying, they have a traditional view of marriage, that's offensive to some groups, will some people stop shopping there? Sure, but I'll tell you in New York City, and partly they were insulated from this because they were broadly Southern to a significant degree in terms of their base, of where their restaurants were, But in New York City, the line's out the door. So it's not as if they can't compete in other markets either unless they're trying to go to a university and then they get kicked off campus because of the political fight, not because there's no demand. I think students would still want to buy the sandwiches in enough numbers to make it viable if they were allowed on campus. So, you know, these consumer sorts of blowbacks, I think, are actually pretty rare. But when they get to the RD stuff, and which is why the voting rights thing became a bigger thing in Georgia. And listen, if the president's going to tell people this is worse than Jim Crow, which is what the president of the United States was saying, okay, if that were true, then you'd sort of, the companies leaning in make some sense. Now I know that the rules in Georgia, I mean, you could pick apart this and that rule. I'm not saying they're the optimal set of rules that the legislature was drafting, and legislators are always going to draft rules that they think help themselves, right? And help their party and help their reelection prospects. One of the things in Buckley v. Vallejo, when the Supreme Court recognized political spending as speech in 1976, that my mentor, Judge Winter, for whom I clerked, a Yale law professor, was arguing this before the court, and what convinced like William Brennan and Thurgood Marshall, the left flank of the court on this issue, is like, well, they set the maximum expenditure limit for a campaign at just below the most successful expenditure of any challenger to an incumbent in the prior election. You know, they always want to create, elected officials always want to create barriers to entry to their own defeat, right? I mean, so that's not surprising, but what I also know is that the rules in Georgia make it much easier to vote in the upcoming election than it was ever for me to vote in New York when I lived there for 20 years, right? I mean, that's just a fact. It was hard to vote in New York the 20 years I lived there. And so there's sometimes a lack of perspective, but you know, the companies, I think Delta and Coca-Cola stepped out a little too far and they pulled back pretty quickly because of that. But when it comes to these meta RD issues, I mean, listen, did CEOs pull out of Trump's advisory council after the Charlottesville thing? Sure. I mean, they can be risk averse, they can pull out, but I think by and large, as long as they avoid anything that can become an RD issue, they've got degrees of freedom there. And so, you know, the question for us as a society is, you know, how do we react to this? Because, I mean, we can't really take away these degrees of freedom. The corporations need to have a marketing strategy. Part of it has to be politics. They've got to be able to lobby, which is why we need to think, you know, how does antitrust law fit with these tech companies? How does something like common carrier regulation fit with a bank, fit with the sort of internet architecture, which I don't totally understand, but the tech people tell me there are ways they could have. I mean, we know the choke points for things like apps on the phones and things like this. That's different from Twitter and Facebook, but how can we create new entrants to compete with them?
So that's something that's come up right now, because I mean, I think we all know that activism is good and positive. It's enshrined in our Constitution. I mean, I'm vice chairman of Young Americans for Freedom, so we did in college. But at what point does this kind of corporate activism become separating us as an American people? For example, with tech, the company I started, RightForge, with some partners who are much smarter than me 13 months ago, does internet servers. We exist because Amazon Web Services made a decision about Parler. Now we're doing very well. We've got a huge amount of customers, and people are coming to us saying, well, we need to set up banks with you. Because we can't get loans to American gun manufacturers, get loans to American energy producers based on different ESG scores or financial decisions that the CEOs made and the boards made. But it seems like there's a potential for a second economy forming, where there's one group of internet and technology and banking systems for liberals and one for conservatives, and the people in between can do whatever they want. Do you see that as something that's been growing, Scott, or something that's maybe it's gone too far, or do you think that's overblown?
Well, I'd say currently it's overblown, but it's an interesting thing to keep an eye on, because I don't think, 30 years ago, whenever it was, anyone would have thought a Fox News was possible, because you were watching CNN and seeing weather news all day, and you know, what has happened to cable news, no one anticipated till it happened. Ted Turner had said that he had an opportunity to start, even though, of course, he's not conservative politically, but
I used to think he was.
Well, he had an opportunity before Fox News started to create a conservative channel, which he thought about doing just for business reasons. He decided not to do it, thought, not worth it. And then Fox News comes along and completely changes the game and dominates the space. And there's no reason to think that can only happen in media. There's no reason why what you're saying can't happen if there's that kind of passion against something. If there are enough people that say, I'm conservative, I'm not going to buy Nike sneakers. Well, you've got maybe an Adidas or whoever who doesn't go there in terms of politics. You can go there. But maybe there are areas where I actually want a brand that's going to stand up for the values that are important to me. It's a really interesting phenomenon. I mean, you mentioned being divided. We've never been, in my lifetime, this divided. That's why Whitney knows I'm not a debater, so I wasn't, this was not something I would normally do. This has obviously just been a nice discussion, but that's what I think is missing in our society, right? Is people just having discussions where they can not be in these armed camps and they can just talk about things in a civil way. And that's missing. And, look, cable news, it's people yelling at each other, it's bullhorns. That's what Washington has become. That's what state capitals, that's what sells. And increasingly, I think there is a legitimate reason to fear that could happen with brands, because brands are taught to put simple messages out there, right? They're not taught to just do it, right? It's not, here's a very long statement on my nuanced beliefs on this political issue. And so certainly, I think it's an interesting question. I honestly hadn't thought a lot about it, but I don't see why it couldn't happen. A quick thing I wanted to say about Chick-Fil-A, since I guess there's Chick-Fil-A here?
Yeah.
I don't smell yet. But
They're holding them captive until the
they're
end.
actually a brand that I think has walked the line pretty well. Because, yes, their ownership, leadership has, as individuals, supported conservative causes. But they have been very consistent in saying, as a brand, we do not have political viewpoints. And they've said it, I think, consistently enough that there's general acceptance of that. I know there was a movement, you probably know where I saw, there was some move somewhere in some state where they were going to have Chick-fil-A at rest stops. And the state government, some Democrats said, no, Chick-fil-A's anti-LGBTQ, and we got to ban them from these rest stops. That stuff really hasn't gone anywhere. I thought one of my favorite lines from the 2020 campaign, the presidential campaign on the Democratic side, was when Mayor Pete was asked about Chick-fil-A and if he was opposed to their anti-LGBTQ views and support. He said, well, yes, but I'm kind of in favor of their chicken. And I thought, can't I still like the chicken? So I think it's
like the line in Times Square at Chick-fil-A is around the corner. The mayor said, don't move in. And if you interview the average person in line about the politics of Chick-fil-A, they have no idea and don't care.
And that's how the market generally works, right? I mean, I don't know, my favorite restaurants I go to, all the shops I go to, I generally don't know the politics of the owner. I mean, maybe if it's like a gun shop, I might, or something, or but I might a few of these places, but your ordinary places you go shopping, you don't know what the owners are now. What shifted, I do think that the social media connectivity has changed that, because people are now aware. I'm aware of people's politics that are connected to me that I never really was before. We never talked about it. It's not something that, but people will use their social media in these ways, so people are more, people know what my views were, because that's what I do, right? But the average person wasn't out there broadcasting what their politics were, and now, first of all, you can Google your neighbor, find out what their party registration is. You can find out their political giving. People do this. And so it's different. It's a connected world. Now, the media thing's a little different, and it's kind of a return to normalcy in the sense that, the 19th century generally, most cities had a conservative and a left-wing paper. They had a Democrat paper and a Republican paper and a Whig paper and a populist paper or a progressive paper, depending on the political movements of the day. This was the norm, right? And we sort of had this consolidation where there was this sort of Yeah, and it always continued somewhat with newspapers. I mean, my family growing up, we had the center-left paper, we had the sort of center-right free market paper, and then we sort of had the conservative weekly paper that was pretty, this was the Jesse Helms social conservative paper, and we had them all in our house, and we would read them. Now, not everyone did it. Most people sort of liked their confirmation biases, which is what Roger Ailes figured out with Fox News. He's like, okay, well, all these other networks are center-left, and they were center-left. They weren't hard-left. They weren't like MSNBC is now, but okay, there's a niche here that's underserved. I can take that niche and I can make a lot of money with it. And then, of course, it's prompted a reaction back on the other side. And it's also that the value of news has dropped because it's on your phone instantly. I mean, you don't need to wait for the daily paper to get national news. You don't need to wait for the nightly broadcast with Walter Cronkite on CBS to get the nightly news the way my daddy always did. You don't need to wait for the nightly ticker to see the stock returns for the day. It's instantly available on your phone. So this has changed it, and it's changed ESPN too, right? I mean, ESPN used to have SportsCenter, and you'd go, I remember being in college, we're going to watch what happened in the games tonight. Well, now you know instantly what's happened in the games, and so they have all these talking heads yelling at each other on ESPN during the day and during their non-live sports programming. So, these changes are technologically driven, and they're having some of these impacts as well. So,
this has been great, but you guys took some time off from a beautiful spring day to come in here and listen. So I wonder if we have any questions from the audience, or we can continue this conversation if not. Do we need to get a mic or anything? Whitney, or I can repeat the question.
Yeah, repeat the question.
Okay, so I was just wondering about Section 230, if you guys had any thoughts on that and how we apply it.
Thoughts on Section 230, gentlemen?
I'll let you.
I mean, Section 230, for those of you who don't know, this is a prophylactic protection that Congress enacted in the 90s on the internet, basically, that shields companies from liability for things. If they're curating, they can't just get sued. So if the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal comes out with an article, they could be sued for defamation under libel law. If I put something on Facebook, you can't sue Facebook for that. And so there are some people out there that say, oh, let's get rid of this Section 230, and then Facebook could get sued for whatever's on there for defamation. Now, I think what that effectively does is kill the business model, really, for Facebook and Twitter and these sorts of things, because they just couldn't afford that level of liability. It protects, I used to run weblogs. I got involved in a threatened libel litigation over weblog that was on a comment board that someone else curated for a story that we cross-linked to, right? And these things sort of protect against that. I think a rethinking of libel law for the internet era is probably overdue broadly. I don't know that Section 230, unless your goal is to just kill social media, I don't know that Section 230 dropping the protection would do what necessarily people think it would. But there may be ways to sort of lean on it, right? I mean, the whole thing is these are sort of choke points, and who has the most vested interest in this? Well, it is these sorts of companies. So rattling the saber does at least potentially change the way they may behave. I mean, to me, it is bizarre that Twitter has a former president of the United States, banned from Twitter. At the same time, the sitting president of Russia, who's invading another country that everyone's cutting off their bank and everything else, he's got an account at Twitter. But this is, and again, businesses are strategic here. Even something like Ukraine, it's like, and Russia. I mean, Russia's a massive player on the international stage. They've got all these nuclear weapons, but their economy's the size of Texas. Nobody's taking these hard lines against China. None of these businesses are. There's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. Their economy's a lot bigger than Texas, right? So all of these are strategic calculations, and they come into play. But Section 230. Listen, I mean, it's worth thinking about. There may be a way to tweak it. I think just eliminating it. Then they're going to curate much, much more aggressively, if anything, right? But if you tweak it without any changes to current libel law, you could basically kill the business model. Because even though we've got strong substantive protections under libel law, under a precedent called New York Times v. Sullivan from the 60s, it's hard to win a libel suit, certainly if you're a public figure or a semi-public figure. But the way our system's structured, and I talk about this in my book too in litigation, I mean, you get dragged into court you've still got to respond to motions. You've still got to go through discovery, be deposed, turn over all your email. I mean, the costs mount. So somebody threatens me with libel, and it's happened on multiple occasions. I've run weblogs, I work for a think tank. Like, okay, well, we have an insurance policy, we have a media insurance policy, but, they can make us blow through the $25,000, deductible on that policy limit like that. And they know it. And so people will do it. And so now some states have what's called like an anti-slap law, strategic lawsuits against public participation, and other sorts of prophylactics that make that harder to do, but not all states. And of course, plaintiffs find states where they can sue.
Yeah, and I would add, I think a better solution to get at what removing Section 230 is trying to solve would be antitrust and to just break up these companies. Because I think what happens is, and I can give you a couple examples, if you remove it and open up the liability, it's the most rich and powerful party in the disagreement always wins. So a great example was Gawker. If you remember, Gawker was a publication that Peter Thiel really didn't like.
Well, I think they outed him, right?
Yes, but he stayed mad. He didn't. It was true, so he didn't do anything about it then because he couldn't sue them. But it was Hulk Hogan, right? Hulk Hogan there was a sex tape or something that came out. It was unauthorized. It was a clear case of Gawker doing something they shouldn't have done. So Peter Thiel funded this to the point that it put Gawker out of business. So you could say, Gawker sucks, I'm glad they're out of business, but you've got to feel a little uncomfortable that it was just a billionaire's wealth that put a media outlet of whatever political stripe out of business. You should feel a little weirded out by that, and that's the factor, whatever politics the billionaire is and whatever politics the media outlet is. Rather than this stuff being taken to libel court, I'd rather just have more players out there. And just like we have MSNBC, who, if any, you guys are too young to know this, but MSNBC, that was Microsoft and NBC, and the idea was that, we're the more tech cable news company. That was their thing. There was nothing political about it, but it was really boring. And then when Fox came along, MSNBC had like 0 ratings. And so they thought, gosh, they're making all this money. Why don't we do the liberal version of that? So you imagine, because there's enough options on cable TV that you can have different points of view, and you could have more options than you currently do in the tech space if you just exercise antitrust law, I think.
I don't think we'd even be having this conversation, though, probably, if not for Donald Trump and his impact that he had in American political discourse and business discourse, where you could go to a journalism business conference, which previously, the Daily Caller had a pretty liberal head of sales. He didn't care. It was about making a profit. The head of Politico sales, I think, might have been more of a Republican. He didn't care. That all changed under Donald Trump. There were conferences on what do we do now as a corporation. So I'm sure that was great for business. But do you think that he has changed, and both of you, that Donald Trump has changed this dynamic forever, or that companies are going to retreat? Talking to local business owners, small business owners in D.C., about, for example, the shutdowns. My friends say, well, I can't afford to make a political stance. I can't afford to upset a single customer. I need everyone in my place, in this place. Is this changed forever, or is this more of a Trump phenomenon?
Well, it remains to be seen, but Trump did change the playing field dramatically for corporations. And keep in mind that we were talking a little bit before about the politics of corporations and CEOs. In general, they have big companies, large, diverse workplaces. They're more urban. They're located in urban centers. These are workplaces that do not necessarily would not support a set of views that appeals to rural America, rural white America in the way that Trump's appeal does. You need some kind of approach that's going to be a big enough tent, at least for your company, that you can have shared values that everyone can get behind, or else you're just going to have this kind of division and strife within a company, particularly as it gets larger. I'll give you a quick example of, I think, the right way to do it. You know, you might have heard of this concept of social purpose or company purpose, which is, you know, when we used to do branding exercises for our clients, we'd start with, you know, let's get to the essence of what you do. But now we start with, let's get to the essence of why you exist. And if you exist just to make a buck, people will probably not want to work for you because that sounds boring. And people probably don't want to buy from you because then you're just a commodity. They can buy your widget from someone else just like they could from you. So can you come up with a larger reason for being around? What was that original passion that got you to start the company? Were you trying in some way to make the world a better place? And if you can tie that in, then everything can line up so nicely. And to kind of close the loop on the stakeholder capitalism idea, it can become a very natural thing where it's not forced from the outside. A great example of a company that does it really well is Lego. They're a $7 billion company. They made, the last earnings that I saw, they made $1.5 billion profit on $7 billion in revenues. That's pretty darn good. But they also have an extremely aggressive sustainability initiatives, DEI initiatives. They do a lot and invest a lot in protecting children from online predators. But why this is so compelling is they've tied this all into a social purpose narrative or a purpose-driven narrative. So I don't just sell plastic bricks to kids. I am empowering them to learn and to build and become the future builders of tomorrow. That's what my product does. And I protect children online from predators because they need to learn and grow in that environment in order to become the future builders of tomorrow. I am involved in sustainability because they have to have a world, you know, when they grow up to become the builders of tomorrow. And I believe, as Lego, that the world is better off, and we all learn, and we're all better off if we're learning from each other in a diverse, inclusive, equitable environment. And that's creating a better world for the builders of tomorrow. So what Lego does is it takes all these different threads that could be treated separately, and you could be, oh, you need to be more sustainable, or you need to be this. And they said, we're going to own this, and we're going to make all of it our brand. And they've proven that you can do that and still make a whole lot of money.
And where are they incorporated?
Not here.
Denmark?
Right. I mean, I do think there are very different
Not
sort
Delaware.
of legal structures. This is a Danish company. Different legal structures, ownership structures, and I am of the belief that our sort of dispersed capitalism shareholder model is one reason why the United States is able both to absorb large numbers of immigrants, certainly relative to Scandinavia, and continue to grow, and the creative destruction of capitalism we have is so robust. I mean, right, Amazon, Tesla, Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, Google. I mean, none of these existed when I was a kid. None of them, right? These are among the top 8 companies in the world in terms of market capitalization today. I mean, we create through venture capital and all these other sorts of things this sort of engine of economic growth, and I don't think that would exist if we ran on a more European model, which is what Elizabeth Warren is expressly pushing, right? She wants to get rid of state corporate chartered federalism and have it all through the federal government, big companies under federal rules, and turn them all into these sort of stakeholder model, you know, purpose sorts of corporations. Now listen, I have no problem with someone, you know, Ben and Jerry's is a good domestic example, someone who wants to set up, this is our objective, this is what we want to do, you invest in it. You know, I mean, I think you're giving up a little something as an investor to invest in that sort of company, but you know it going in, fine. Same, just like a social investing fund or an ESG fund. I have a lot strong opinions on what the rules should be about how they influence corporate boards of directors, but that's a very different question than how you want to invest your own money, how you want to organize your own company. I do think we'll see a continuing growth. I think we've seen growth in this in both regards. I do think there are a number of people, particularly of your generation, and a little bit older, who want to feel good about their company. And listen, I'm sympathetic to that. I'm in the idea world for a reason, right? I care about the ideas I talk about. That's why I'm doing this, as opposed to investment banking or management consulting, both of which I dabbled with a little bit when I was younger. But But I think that there's a reason why equity capitalism exists, and there are counterexamples, right? Insurance used to be banks. You don't really see a lot of mutual banks anymore, but back in the day, before we had modern banking regulation, insurance regulation, if you were a customer of your insurance company, your bank, they could take your money, right? So that's why State Farm, for example, Allstate's a publicly traded corporation owned by equity shareholders. State Farm is still a mutual one owned by policyholders, and policyholders will get dividends. And you see the same thing with like agricultural cooperatives, and some farm Land O'Lakes as an agricultural cooperative. So we see these, but there's a reason why we disperse ownership and control. And to do that, we need to have some sort of rules in this. And I think that gets upset when you start muddying the waters and not having a single variable. This is sort of basic public choice theory. There's a Nobel Prize winning economist, Ken Arrow, who developed this. If you've got one issue, you can have a clear democratic outcome. As soon as you move to two, you can't, which is why Republicans and Democrats will cycle, and a lot of it's about branding and which issues you prioritize, and this is what political parties are doing. We want to try to get this issue in the public attention, not that, because you have different coalitions, because most people don't agree with everything that one party or the other stands for. Most people are kind of mixed, but they try to develop these coalitions. You start running businesses that way, it gets ugly. And so there's a reason why our stuff's organized that way, which is a little separate, but I do think that there's a cost to it, but I think we're going to see it because there's a lot of people as employees and as investors who believe in that, and so they want to do it. And there's nothing wrong with permitting that. In my view, what I worry about is mandating that, which is what Elizabeth Warren wants to do.
I think Whitney might have a question.
Yeah, and I don't, I think you maybe answered it, but I always wonder, like, if I see Adidas, and they are publicly traded, right? Adidas. So here's this commercial, and, it's definitely controversial. We're celebrating men and women's sports. Why aren't we, let's just say that the stock price goes down after this commercial runs, because people don't, they don't like it. Why aren't these publicly traded companies just specifically worried about can they be held liable for affecting the stock price with this political statement?
Could they be held liable for that? Not easily, because there's something called the business judgment rule, which exists for a good reason, and it's basically judges aren't going to second guess business decisions, and we don't want judges to second guess business decisions because judges aren't trained to make those decisions. There's duty of loyalty questions where you can win lawsuits, and where these things will really come into play is like when there's a hostile takeover effort or a merger or things like this, and then there are fiduciary duties that really attach. So, but I think the main reason, I don't think the stock price usually does go down. If it does, they will end that campaign.
Yes, ma'am?
So just back to the Section 230 thing. So I've noticed especially the past 2 years, that a lot of these big tech companies are going, not only just suspending like a former president, but they've also like, if you post something that, that might be questionable, like they're like, oh, to learn more about COVID, just go to the CDC, they'll put it under your post and like fact check you literally. And then there's some people like the woman at Virginia Tech who was competing with Leah Thomas in the swim team, and she said, like, I don't like that there's a transgender man on the swim team, and she got suspended from Twitter. So it makes it really hard for you to think that there's not an agenda. And I just kind of wonder, with Section 230, if we got rid of it, would that like basically keep them from fact checking you like that?
No.
Well, I think, yeah, I was just gonna say, I think this is more an issue of bad algorithms than anything else.
Yeah,
this is,
that's right.
there's just too much of this out there, and they've taken so much heat for allowing misinformation, conspiracy theories, that they've taken a very big hammer, and they've taken, it's the baby with the bathwater kind of thing. There's lots of very valid content, and I've seen this across all political stripes that I got banned for saying this. So why, what? I'm in Twitter jail or whatever. And it's a reaction to a problem, but the reaction is creating its own problems. But I don't think 230 would solve it.
They have to have content moderation, right? Otherwise, you'd get lots of porn, lots of spam, lots of harassment, lots of stuff we don't want on these networks, right? So they have to have something, and you know, because they can't hire 1 million people to try to do this and pay them well to analyze each tweet. You know, they have these algorithms, and they're largely consumer driven. Just like you can sort of rank sellers on Amazon or eBay, you know, people who are more provocative, and I have friends on the left who've been in Facebook jail too, many times. People who are more provocative will get somebody who's attached to them somehow complain, and they'll hit the complain button. Now, I do think once they step back and analyze this, is there a left-wing skew and a left-wing bias over time? Yes. And that's because of who's making the decisions and what their predispositions are, I think, primarily. It's a hard thing to fix. I mean, at the end of the day, having competition, I mean, really what needs to happen is what happened with talk radio after the end of the Fairness Doctrine, and then with Fox News. There just needs to be competition. Now, do I think that's healthy for the public discourse? Not really, right? I mean, I think it's better to listen to the other side and not only hit your confirmation biases. I'm the guy who in law school had the National Review and Weekly Standard, but also the New Republic and the American Prospect and even the Nation. And I read them all.
Magazines were good.
But most
Back when all those magazines were
back when they had
long time ago.
Yeah, back when they actually were producing good quality. But even when I thought it was wacky, it was well done. But you know, you don't see most people doing that. You don't see most people like, oh, I'm going to see MSNBC and Fox and go back and forth so I can see what both sides are. Most people don't do that, and so I think it's going to be hard to get there.
Miss? Institutionalizing what?
Social change. For example, in terms of companies needing to have a certain level of diversity, I don't know if like they get sued or what getting in trouble means in terms of the business world, but I'm just kind of worried as, you know, as someone who's going to end up going into work one day, that I don't want to be hired because, you know, they need a brown face. I want to be hired because I can do the work. So what does, kind of understand?
Absolutely.
So just to repeat for our audience, the question was about the dangers of or the pluses of institutionalizing social change and companies needing to have a certain level of ethnic diversity, for example, and how that could impact how colleagues view each other.
And I think, you know, for me, I personally have had a great increase in awareness over the past few years of the things I could be doing that I was not to create a more diverse atmosphere. At my agency, we have 30 people. There were times when there were no minorities in that group. We have about 15% now. We have a DEI committee. These are things that didn't happen by accident. I have a good friend who is African American who owns an agency, and he had all kinds of talent that was very diverse. And I said, you know, how did you do this? Where can you point me? I want to make an effort, not to hire people who are unqualified, but because I think it's better as an agency. And I don't know that there's ever been a case where someone hired us because we were more or less diverse. But I personally, as a business owner, thought it was something that was important and would make us stronger if we had a wider range of people at the company with different viewpoints, different backgrounds.
Viewpoints are under addressed often in this look.
You know, diversity isn't just how you look. There's a lot of other things too. I mean, one of the things that's least spoken about is ageism, for example. There are all kinds of elements of this. In any case, my friend told me, well, it didn't just happen because I'm black and I have black friends. I got a recruiter. I went my CEO, I recruited him out of New York, you know. I did these things proactively because I wanted to have an agency that was diverse in this way. It made me realize that there were just little things that I could do if I became aware of them to create a better work environment where more people were part of the interview process, as opposed to just posting a job on LinkedIn, for example, or for us, there's the local PRSA, which is Public Relations Society of America. They have a job board. Well, there are other groups, boards that are tied to historically black colleges and universities, to just different groups of people that were not who we had just by default recruited from. And as a result, we're more talented than ever. And we've never made a single decision based on what someone looks like. But we've had a much better talent pool to choose from. I think in every case, we've always chosen the best person from the job. I don't think this should ever be forced on people or institutionalized, but I do think increasingly people think it's just the right thing to do. And I'll give you a quick example. I'm surprised we haven't touched on cancel culture or accountability culture or whatever you want to call it, a call out culture in this talk, because it's kind of the flip side of what we're talking about. You guys may or may not know about Richards Group, the very large advertising firm, largest in the Southwest. A guy named Stan Richards, who kind of an advertising legend. He's 90 years old now, I believe. But at the fall of 2020, he was in an internal meeting looking at a new Motel 6 ad campaign. Motel 6 had been a client of Richards Group for over 30 years. The We'll Leave the Light On For You campaign and all that. Richards Group did the Eat More Chicken campaign for Chick-Fil-A. Anyway, Stan was still at 88 at the time, had the last word on every big campaign. He had to prove it. And he was shown a campaign that was focused on diversity was an element of it. And there were people of different races and ethnicities in these ads. But he looked at it and he said, it's too black. And then he followed up by saying, this would not appeal to Motel 6's significant white supremacist clientele. That there's a part of Motel 6's clientele that would be alienated this because of the race of the people in the campaign. He said that and said it in that way, even though it was an internal meeting, someone immediately passed this on to the client, who immediately passed it on to Ad Age. And in 2 days, Stan Richards was out of his own agency. He had to fire himself, basically. And Richards Group lost 40% of its clients in a week. So you're talking about a brand suffering repercussions. You could say he's an old man, he just had a slip of the tongue, but how does something in an internal meeting like that get out? Typically it's not because it's the first time. Typically it's because people are being not heard in other contexts. And so if you look at where Richards Group is now versus then, they've improved their organization dramatically. They've improved their organization across the board. And it's more diverse, it's more transparent, it's more open. It's unfortunate for Stan Richards that happened. But if, in terms of, we talk about stakeholder capitalism, this is obviously a private company, but if Stan Richards had proactively made the changes they made since he had to step down, including some of the education and anti-bias training and all those things that are just helpful for people to experience, I'm 100% sure that would have never happened. He would have never lost his job. They would have never lost 40% of their clients. So you can be proactive and create a brand that's going to be sturdier because you're focusing on the things that your employees, your clients care about. Or you can just wait for something to happen to you, and then the changes that you resisted or didn't think about will happen after you're gone. And that's what happened in the case of the Richards Group.
I mean, I broadly agree with everything he said, but I'm going to take sort of a different spin on it because, I mean, while I think what he says is correct, I do think, first of all, the sort of empirical evidence on diversity by various metrics is not as one-sided as it's often made out to be. I mean, there's some situations where more homogenous groups outperform, right? I mean, but it's situational. If you're a PR agency, diversity really matters, right? I mean, you know, if you're an ad, because you've got to be sensitive to all sorts of different sorts of people in a different way than, you know, other types of businesses may work. I do agree, though, that this notion of sort of trying to break through, here's how we always get, you know, you go beyond your personal network to go try to hire people. Don't go to the same 4 or 5 schools we've always hired from. There are people out there that you're going to miss. And so just finding talent, you want to be, you know, I mean, again, given budget constraints and everything else, but you want to be, you know, more proactive in that. I think that's generally good given budget constraints. I do think there's a lot of top-downism, though, saying it's being forced, but it is being forced. It is being forced. It's being forced through law, through disparate impact analysis in the law. It's being forced through gatekeepers. You know, I'm on record of this because I have an affidavit in litigation against NASDAQ, against the Securities and Exchange Commission for rubber stamping NASDAQ, saying we have to have diversity quotas on boards of directors for NASDAQ-traded corporations. You know, that's active ongoing litigation. Whether the side I'm on wins or not, I don't know, but I think there's a decent chance it will, right? Because there are laws in place that say you can't discriminate on the basis of race or sex. So to then turn around and say we're going to force that creates an instant legal problem. Notwithstanding that NASDAQ's doing it, it's a little trickier for Goldman Sachs to get sued over it, where they say we're not going to take a company public. Well, there's so much discretion there, and who's the plaintiff going to be? But with NASDAQ, because the Securities and Exchange Commission's involved and it's the government, you know, you've got a pretty clear lawsuit that you can generate out of it. But no, I mean, I think your concern is a real one. It's a thing that I have friends and family that have faced, right? I mean, you just face it. I mean, one of my best friends, you know, he's a black guy. When he was at Harvard, he walked around with a photocopy of his SAT scores in his pocket because he didn't want people to think, oh, I don't belong here. And my wife, who was black, in every job she's in, I've got to prove that I belong there, right? And it's just, if you have overt preferences that are being pushed, and you say, you know, Ketanji Brown Jackson, who's totally qualified for the Supreme Court. I'm not saying I would agree with everything she does on the Supreme Court, but in terms of background, totally qualified. But when you say, I'm going to pick a black woman, of course people are going to suspect, well, you know, maybe she wasn't the best one. So these are things you're going to have to overcome, and it's an unfortunate side effect of this. I wish we could get past it and be more holistic. I mean, what he's talking about is being holistic, breaking down preconceptions. You know, I think like, you know, racial bias training tends to be garbage, but that doesn't mean it's inherently garbage. I mean, I think racial biases exist, right? I mean, don't always ask my wife to be on the diversity committee. No, these sorts of microaggressions are real, right? I mean, you just sort of learn to ignore them in the business place. But, you know, so those sorts of trainings that could get people to, you know, think about that a little better are good. But unfortunately, as long as there's this pressure put on, and in the university and education context, and listen, that's going to be resolved next year by the U.S. Supreme Court, and SMU being private and University of Texas being public are going to face a regime change on that in 15 months. And they're going to have to react to it. Now, they're going to still try to discriminate on the basis of race, and there'll be continued litigation because enforcing these legal rules becomes tricky. But the actual legal standard will change next June. But it becomes an issue, right? Because everyone wants the same talent. So when you have talent mismatches in terms of the pools, which isn't a fault of the individuals, you're going to have these recurring situations. So, you know, Harvard, Yale, and Stanford Law School soak up 100% of the black applicants with a 170 plus SAT, right? This is why you have a gap in Grutter v. Bollinger in the Supreme Court in 2003, because there's just no more pool. I mean, so if you want to have any black students that are they're not going to be near your 25th percentile because there aren't enough applicants, right? And so the reason for that is deep and systemic and historical, and it's hard to fix, right? But it creates these sorts of situations in education establishments, and unfortunately, that's going to be somewhat the situation in businesses you go into as well. But listen, if you're good and do a good job, people get over it very fast. No, you know, people will be prejudicial, but you can get past it. And so just stick in there, do a good job, You know, I mean, it hasn't, I have friends that have been extremely successful in a variety of careers who are people of color who've done really, really well, including, you know, a spouse, but also very, very, very good friends of mine who've excelled in these sorts of environments. But you are going to get, you know, people may have those presuppositions, at least some.
Thomas Sowell wrote about that a lot, the late great economist. But we're about out of time, and it's about dinner time. So thank you very much, Scott. Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you very much for seeing you. And don't forget, if you're interested, the books are Trust Signals, Brand Building in a Post-Truth World, and The Unelected, How an Unaccountable Elite is Governing America. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks to our sponsors, the Arthur Roop Foundation, the Karpus Family Foundation, SMU, and Young America's Foundation. Let's eat.
That was fun.
That was a great conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.